So this first talk is really about what are the limitations on how much we can infiltrate water. So we've already had quite a bit of discussion on that this morning, just in the last few minutes. There's been the discussion, if the water table's high, should we have soak wells at all? And as Marcus said, and as Kieran's data shows, they're likely not to actually be able to function when the water table is shallow. But because we've all been brought up for the last 20 years or so thinking we should be infiltrating stormwater, we've actually got ourselves into a bit of a bind. We've got ourselves into a bit of a difficulty, I think, in Perth. Because we're all feeling that the right thing to do is to infiltrate stormwater. And I think that was okay, as we said earlier, when the water table was deep in the early development of Perth urban areas. But now we're dealing with all these areas where the water table is shallow. It's getting more and more difficult to actually achieve that infiltration. So even if you put your soak wells in, the water may not actually go into the ground. And a few speakers have talked about this over the years, that we probably should be heading more towards a conveyance system again, and encouraging the local authorities to manage that water rather than trying to infiltrate it. So I suppose this talk now is really me reflecting on the projects I've been involved in about the last 20 years, where we've tried to infiltrate water in different situations. And there's really nothing new in this paper, this talk I'm giving. It's really me rehashing information which I've published in the past. So this one is headed SIA Workshop, Stormwater Harvesting by Infiltration. This is Soil and Groundwater Limitations. So to me, this is trying to bring some reality into the discussion and saying, you may want to infiltrate, but there are conditions when it's just not going to happen. And you've got to accept that the physical properties of the soil and the environment may not allow you to infiltrate. Okay. So this is really what I'm going to talk about. Now, I have got written copies of this paper, if anybody would like one afterwards, as we do for Gregorio's talk, which was just given. So this one, I'm going to give a brief introduction and then review two previous conference papers, one of which was on the first one was on this deep water table. So I am distinguishing the two situations of sites, one where we've got a deep water table, which basically doesn't interfere with infiltration, and secondly, where we've got a shallow water table, which, as Marcus and others have referred to, it does interfere with infiltration. Then I'm going to review some work by CSIRO and then just summarise with just a list of projects that we've done. So as we all know, infiltration of stormwater has many advantages over discharge, as Bill reminded us. We've got the opportunity for subsequent reuse by abstraction bores. We've got the natural removal of stormwater within the soil profile. We've got the attenuation of downstream flows, reducing the flood risk and the requirements for drainage. So we can all see if we can infiltrate, there's lots of advantages. I've just come back from Melbourne last weekend. We all know that in the eastern states, they don't do this sort of stuff. They don't try and infiltrate. It's just not an option. And I think increasingly the sites we're now developing, we have to recognise that that's the situation we face here as well. So the new sites being developed in Perth are much more like, I believe, the eastern states, where we've got to deal with much more surface water. I think that's what Marcus has just reminded us of as well. So disadvantages, we can have an increase in groundwater levels. We can't do it where the soils won't allow, and we can have water standing in basins for a long time, which has got all sorts of public safety and mosquito type issues, if we're trying to infiltrate on sites where it's just not going to work. Okay, so I'm just reiterating, on sites where the water table is deep and soils are permeable, the advantages generally outweigh the disadvantages, and that was much of the development on the coastal plain until recent years. But on sites where the water table is shallow and the soils are less permeable, the disadvantages may outweigh the advantages. And much of current development is on such sites. So this talk really builds on two particular papers which I was involved in. So this was an IPWEA conference 1996, which is about 16 years ago. That was to do with deep water tables, and the following year on shallow water tables. So this is to do with deep water table. So just bear with me. This may look a boring diagram, but I love it. So that is the ground surface there, and this is the water in a basin. And this is saturated soil, and that is dry soil, and this is a wetting front going down. Deep water table, so the water table is down here somewhere. So what we're talking about now is the rate at which this water goes into the ground. And it's governed by this equation here. That's your permeability, and this is a gradient here. And on the top there, you can see that if you've got a depth of water in your basin, it's driving the water through the soil. Driving the water through the soil. So if you've got a metre of head in a basin, it really does help to push that water into the ground. I did see Graham Withers earlier today. Graham, are you here? No? Graham was with City of Melville a long time ago now, and he installed some water level recorders rather like those Marcus has showed us Kieran has installed in Gosnells. Graham installed these in 1993, 94 in some infiltration basins, and this is a number of hydrographs superimposed, and I've put a dark line on the recession here which shows the rate at which water was going into the ground. So the water was actually going into the ground at a higher rate when there was more water in the basin. So that's with 2.5 metres of water in the basin. The water level was actually falling very steeply. It was going into the ground at about 7 metres a day. Whereas when the water level was only about 1 metre or so, it was going into lower rate. So in that equation, the gradient is higher when you've got a good depth of water in your basin and only a thin layer of wetting front. And this is that green and amped equation. I'll skip over that one. I'll skip over that. No, I'll put that there. So we actually started doing this in the early 90s because people were using this PC sump model, and we couldn't get it to fit, this Melville data. So I said to Graham, we're going to have to write our own spreadsheet, which we did with this green and amped model, and it seemed to fit a lot better. So apologies to Jeff Cox or anybody else who is marketing PC sump, but I do feel it's very conservative. It'll tend to give you an oversized basin. I think it underestimates the infiltration rate with the deep water table case. So that's what we found. We compared a few different situations, and our in-house infill model gave us less storage required than this PC sump model. So that was some conclusions from that first paper, which is published today. The infiltration rate is high at the start of a storm and decreases to equal the hydraulic conductivity of the soil later in the storm. So initially you've got a hydraulic gradient of greater than 1, and later in the storm that gradient comes down towards 1, so that your vertical infiltration equals K later in the storm, whereas earlier it can be several times the vertical K. This is deep water table with a wetting front moving down. So we developed this in-house model. We don't market it, but we do use it on our projects. Anybody's free to develop their own, of course. PC sump overestimates, we believe. Now, many basins did not overflow in February 92. I referred to this storm earlier. I did actually document it for IPWEA, and I can send anybody a report if they want it. Does anybody remember it? February 92, weekend? No. Only me. Okay. Everybody else was enjoying themselves because it was Saturday and Sunday. But anyway, it was a 100-year storm over durations about 6 hours to 24 hours. So you would expect basins to overflow if they were going to. City of Stirling, I see Mike Groves here today. They did a survey of all their basins. I think it's true to say most of them did not overflow. Some did. Some did. Okay. But generally there wasn't much storm damage. There's hardly anything in the newspapers about the flood because there's virtually no damage. But if that happened in the eastern states, 100-year storm, there'd be quite a bit of damage. So again, I think we are over-designing. We get a rare storm and there isn't much damage. Makes us feel comfortable because none of us are going to get litigated against. But on the other hand, society may be spending more on drainage than it should be. I do think councils need to do some monitoring, and this is similar to what Mark has said. People need to collect some data and just see what's happening. I'm really having a bit of an ego trip today. We did get the Best Paper Award for that, actually, in 1996. I won't get one this year because I put the papers in too late altogether. But anyway, IPWEA seemed to encourage us at that time. So there I've just talked about deep water table infiltration. That's really easy to do. Now we've got shallow water table, and this is, we know where we all come unstuck when we're trying to design infiltration basins with shallow water table or clay soils, and it's just not going to happen. So in this paper we were actually comparing an American model called MODRET, which is based on the ModFlow model that Gregorio's just talked about. It's a saturated groundwater flow model designed specifically for infiltration basins in the US, which is available if anybody wants to buy it. It's actually in imperial units and it's got lots of bugs in it, but we do use it. I don't think anybody else in Perth is using it, but we've probably been using it enough that there's a few people in the office who know what to do to get it to give the right sort of answer. That's basically what it does. You see, the basin fills up, it saturates this zone here down to the water table, rather like the soak wells that Marcus was showing, and you get the saturated groundwater occurring. So you need a model that has that. This PC sump shallow water table, it assumes there is no flow into the water table, so I've drawn a line across there. This PC sump only allows water to move above the water table. So again, it tends to overestimate basin areas because it doesn't allow for the fact that the water actually moves into the water table. I'm not going to go into this. Because I want to give us more time for a general discussion, I think. For shallow water table basins, the infiltration rate depends on the hydraulic gradient from the basin water level to the groundwater. Now, as we've said, simplistically, you might think the infiltration rate is going to equal the soil hydraulic conductivity. So if we have a K of, say, 5 meters a day, you might think the water's going to go in at that rate. Well, it will under unit gradient, which is the deep water table case, but it won't where the water table is shallow because you'll have a gradient that might be 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000. So the velocity will then be K divided by 1,000, and you'll get a very slow rate of water movement. It requires a model like MODRET. I've put those same 2 points on there again. Now this is some work which CSIRO have done in Perth, which Don McFarlane talked about this at Hydropolis actually in 2010. So CSIRO has been looking generally at where stormwater could be infiltrated as a means of managing it and reusing it. So they have modelled from up at Gingin down to past Mandurah. This is actually depth to groundwater. The colours didn't come out very well, but this colour here is really the Nangara Mound, and that's greater than 40 metres. But these red areas here, you can see most of south of Perth has this shallow water table that we're all very conscious of. less than 2 meters to the groundwater. This is the same area. They've classified the soils here. We can see this dark brown is the clay and silt, which again tends to be focused south of Perth. So if we haven't got sand and clay, we've got a shallow water table. It's either one or the other or both in the expanding area of Perth. Infiltration rates are expected to be low, much higher in the north here. And this is where they felt that infiltration could work well. Again, it correlates well with the Nangara Mound. And this is the adverse area down here again. So that's a bit of a regional approach there taken by CSIRO in a paper by Smith and Pollock. I have just listed here, this is just page 1 of several pages, of where my company has done infiltration basin sizing. So this is in the paper. We've listed the local authorities. So they range from Shire of Esperance, this is actually on the port at Esperance, on the jetty, where they're infiltrating stormwater. City of Stirling, Churchlands campus. Quite a lot. Iluka Sump, Coastal and Webley, we actually monitored that one in Joondalup to check what the infiltration rate was, because we have sized that smaller than the Wanneroo criteria, which was approved as long as we did 2 years of monitoring to show how it performed. Kieran did that, I think, when he was with us. So I just thought out of interest we would add this list to show people at least projects we've worked on. But just about all these will be where the water table is deep and the soils are suitable. And that is generally where people have tried to infiltrate. So these are now, I think, conclusions. Infiltration basins are most suited where the water table is deep and soils are permeable. Shallow water tables and impermeable soils will have low infiltration rates. They'll tend to be standing water for long periods. Basin sizing requires appropriate use of models and data to calibrate them. And many new land developments on the Swan Coastal Plain, particularly Murray-Armadale SJ, are not suitable for infiltration basins. That's it.